All right. All right. Hello and welcome, inventors and entrepreneurs. My name is Andrew Krause. I'm one of the co-founders here at Inventor Groups of America, or we also refer to us as IGA. Stephen and myself co-founded a company called InventRight 23 years ago, where we coach and mentor inventors to license their products. Through InventRight, we've spoken to inventor groups across the country for the last 23 years. One of the things in doing that we realize is that a lot of these inventor group presidents and leaders and their support team, they really didn't have anybody supporting them. They didn't have a national group supporting them. So we started IGA, Inventor Groups of America, to support inventor group presidents and the people, these angels, running inventor groups across the country. Then we decided to expand our help to include free educational webinars like the one we have for you today. At IGA, we provide individuals with options on how to best commercialize their product ideas, as well as strengthen and support inventor groups throughout the nation. We have a directory of local and regional inventor groups on our website with whom we meet every month. And if you're located near one, we highly recommend that and encourage you to join your local inventors group. We would love to hear your name and what state and country you're from. So go on over right now to the chat box and let us know your name, maybe either state or country you're from, and also let us know if you're brand new. If this is your first time, write "this is my first time" or whatever else you want to write. Now, please do not disclose anything that's confidential or not already publicly available. This meeting is being recorded and will be harnessed on our website as well as our YouTube channel for IGA. If you have any questions for the speaker, please type them into the chat as they come to you. We will choose a few questions to ask at the end of the presentation. Maybe during too, but if you have a thought, something that's on topic, please type it in. We're going to kind of try to keep it on topic, so try to keep it on topic if you can. Now I'm going to turn things over to IGA's Marketing Director, Madeline Key, who's going to introduce our very special guest and moderate today's session. Thank you, Madeline.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, IGA. Hi, inventors. My name is Madeline Key, and I'm so thrilled to be here with you today, as well as have Dr. Ben Schrag here with us, who has volunteered his time to share with us about a couple really important programs that I believe all creative people should know about. He is the program director with the Small Business Innovation Research / Small Business Technology Transfer Programs at the National Science Foundation. The National Science Foundation, also referred to as the NSF, awards over $200 million annually to startups and small businesses through these programs. Specifically, these grants support R&D across almost all areas of science and technology, and they're specifically to help companies de-risk technology for commercial success. The grants are non-dilutive, meaning the inventors are not required to give away any ownership of their business. I've been hearing about these programs for a couple years now, and I also regularly hear from inventors who need to raise some additional funds to continue conducting R&D. So I thought, who better to speak with about it? And specifically, I think regardless of whether you're working on a consumer product or you're an academic inventor, there's some things that all inventors really face and have to accomplish in order to be successful. And one of those is communicating your idea. And there's this idea that people invest in people, not necessarily ideas. So it's not only really communicating your idea, it's also communicating that you're someone that a licensee should partner with or a venture capitalist should invest in. Prior to working at the NSF, Dr. Schrag was the Director of Research and Development at Micromagnetics, where he led a development effort to commercialize a new magnetic imaging tool for semiconductor metrology. During this time, he also served as a visiting scientist at Brown University. Thank you very much, Ben, for joining us. I know you have some slides to share, so I think we should kick off the presentation there, and hopefully I can gently pepper you in between, or maybe wait till the end to ask a few questions as well.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Andrew and Madeline, for the opportunity. Thanks everyone for your time today. And I'm trying to keep it fairly light on slides. I do have a few just to set some context here. Love to answer questions. Madeline, I'll let you decide what makes the most sense, but I really hope this is a two-way street and I can learn a little bit more about what your questions are and what you guys are all working on. So let me share here. And again, just holler if you need to stop me and ask questions here.
Sure.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, again, I work for the National Science Foundation. I actually happen to be a couple blocks from where Madeline is here in Alexandria, Virginia. We are a federal agency. So the NSF is, just to give a little bit of context, we're about an $8.5 billion federal agency, and we're a funding agency, which is to say that all the people who work here in this agency, the primary thing we do is we figure out how to allocate funding. So kind of like an investor, that's what an investor does. But we're allocating funding to science and engineering R&D. That's what we do. Most of our agency is actually giving funding to scientists and researchers who are many times in universities and who are they're doing basic science. They're discovering the world. They're doing particle physics and astronomy and biology and chemistry, and they're getting Nobel Prizes, which we're very proud of, and learning about and publishing the results. So that's what most of this agency does. I'm going to talk about what I do. I am part of a small team that works in the small business programs here at NSF. These are the two kind of flagship programs for small business within the agency. They're earmarked directly to only be open to American for-profit small businesses. And instead of funding basic research here, we are funding mostly startups to bring new disruptive technology to market, as Madeline indicated. And so the funding we provide is less about basic science and more about building great companies. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that. So as you mentioned, Madeline, this is a federal agency. We typically work at scale, and so our program features about a staff of about 25 federal staff. We fund and give out non-dilutive funding to about 500 companies per year receive a check from us across the United States. There's about 900 startups and small businesses in the country that are getting supported by us actively at any given time. And the goal here is to fund again, small companies with deep technology innovations. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means, but basically the idea is we're funding companies that have risky, innovative technology that may be unproven, may not eventually work once somebody tries to make it into a product. But if it does, has the potential to disrupt the market that they're targeting. I am one of 12 program directors in the field in this program, and my background is kind of, I think, like a lot of yours. I was trained as a physicist. At some point in my graduate studies, I came up with learned some things and made some new stuff that we thought could be the basis for a new product. And we started a company when I was finishing my PhD work. And so I was an entrepreneur. I was working with a small company for 7 years, and the first funding that my startup got was actually from this program. And that's what got us off the ground about 20 years ago now. And so I am like my colleagues who are kind of leading this program and making the decisions on which companies to support. We all have this kind of dual experience, which is to say we've all been technically trained in science and engineering in various fields, in biology and chemical engineering and so on. And we all have also had, in most cases, either startup founder experience or startup investor experience. So we actually have been in those roles that I think many of you are, where we've got something new, we don't quite know what to do, trying to build something from nothing, basically. Our funding is in the form of, we said non-dilutive. What that usually looks like is a research and development grant. I'm not going to get too much into the government bureaucracy about how awards look, but the idea here is it's a very flexible instrument to pay for research and development at the small business. There's no payback, and there is no equity position. We don't take any board seats. So again, we leave all those things in the control of the small business. This is a program with phases. We start with a check typically for about $250,000. And if you do well, then you might get a check of about $1 million a year or two later. And based on, again, there's some different minutiae about how the funding comes out, but and most companies that are doing well can expect to have the potential of receiving about $2 million throughout between 3 to 5 year process of our program. I'll give you a sense about the types of companies we focus on. So our program is congressionally mandated. It's actually a program that the NSF piloted back in the 70s, and Congress liked so much that they mandated it. So you will see this program, which is called the SBIR STTR program. You will see it at 11 different federal agencies, and all of them have different theses for their investment, but they're all non-dilutive and they're all giving funding for research and development for entrepreneurs and inventors. So we're actually not a biggest piece of the pie. We're 230 million, but this program is a $4 billion program across the government. And so there are other agencies that have much bigger budgets than we do. Our real focus here within this set of federal agencies is that we're the only agency that's really focused on commercially aggressive startups. And so you can see the data here. We're trying to be the first funding into companies. That's the goal. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of that. The average company we fund when we write our first check, the average is 2 employees, and the average is about 2 years old for the company. Other agencies are closer to 20 and 10 for those data points. Almost all the companies we fund now, about 80% at this point, when we fund them, they are submitting their first ever federal grant application. So it is something where it's a little bit of a process to get funded, but it is not something that you can't succeed at as a first-time entrepreneur, first-time government grant seeker. And this is the goal. The goal for our program is that we at the NSF, we don't directly use this technology. And so when we fund a company, the goal is that they're going to find somebody out there in the world, and they're going to convince us that that technology is going to disrupt a market and create a big opportunity for the company. And so this is, in the last year, this is just a small set of the portfolio companies we funded later on the road, 5 or 10 years later, starting to become seriously commercially successful. And the 2 things to note here, one is that these companies are all kind of, and these are headlines, they're all raising follow-on funding. The goal of our program is not to support your company throughout the funding needs throughout your life cycle. It's just bringing new inventions to market. You all probably know it's too expensive for us to do everything, for us to do all the work. We're trying to fund the first couple of years of your company's needs. And the idea then is that you're going to need to raise typically private financing if you're going to have a scalable commercial impact. So our goal is to get you across that early valley of death to whatever capital it is. It doesn't have to be private capital. It could be bootstrapping, but whatever the next check is going to come from. And so these are some examples of companies that have gotten started with our funding and that have then gone on to raise a significant private capital or have successful exits or licenses. So our portfolio in the last 6 years has raised about $21 billion in follow-on funding compared to about $1 billion that we've put in. So our companies raise $20 or so of follow-on funding for every dollar we seed them with, which we're proud of, which is, I think, a really important sign that, at least for many companies, the model is working.
Definitely.
And so I'm going to just talk a little bit now about how to know kind of what we're looking for. This is the thesis. This is kind of the investment thesis for our program. So one thing to know is that we are congressionally mandated in many ways to basically fund only R&D. The only thing we're going to pay for is technical research and development. That's the only thing that we're allowed to pay for. It's not obviously the only thing that your company needs to do, but there is a phase in many companies with new inventions where that's a big part of what you're doing. And so the goal is you're going to be a good fit only if that company really faces the need to do significant amounts of R&D, and R&D is usually, at least at the beginning, pretty risky. So a lot of times we're looking for risky research tasks to basically make it so you can make this new product exist in the world. And we're really looking for not only R&D, we're looking for technical risk. We're looking for an innovation that might not ever work, not just because you can't get enough time or money to build it, but because the laws of nature might forbid it from happening, right? There might be something just not possible to do. That's the kind of bread and butter for us. We're looking for that because we feel like the private markets don't want to take that technical risk, right? They're willing to take, depending on the investor, some amount of market risk, but there's not a lot of investors out there who want to take on technology risk. It's a very scary thing and unknown to them. And we're the National Science Foundation, so that's what we're used to. So that's one of the reasons we do that. The downside of having these risky, innovative products is that it takes all this R&D funding and this risk could kill your company. The upside is that we hope if you are able to get funding from us and show us that the product works, prove it out, make it work, make it reliable and consistent, that unique invention usually is the core of the barrier to competitors, right? That's the silver bullet your company has that stops anyone from being able to compete with you in the market, right? So it's an unfair competitive advantage. And so that's something we look for when you say, we want to apply to this program, we're going to ask you, okay, what about your company is unique in the world and nobody else can do it? What's the special secret sauce that nobody else can do? And sometimes that means a patent. A patent is the reason why another company can't do it. In some cases, it's a trade secret, but there's got to be an argument as to why your company is not just unique because your team is great. We hope you have a great team, but we want to see that there's something about the technology that is the unique in the world that's going to give you this huge advantage in the market. And then we're looking at the team. Like any investor, the team is probably the most important factor. We really want to see a small business that is going to think big and to think aggressively about taking this concept in many cases and getting it out into the market to solve the problems of customers in a scalable way, right? We're going to invest $2 million. That means we want to see at least a path for you to have some multiple of that in impact in terms of creating jobs and revenues and creating value for your customers. So we want to see that the company really is not just about R&D, it's about bringing that results of the R&D into the market and commercializing, which is most of the time more expensive and takes longer than the technology part.
Yeah.
And then most importantly, we want to see that you understand the need. Because a lot of inventions, you invent something, what is possible is given to you by the laws of nature. That doesn't mean somebody wants what you're producing. There's nothing to say that every invention has a customer that has a big need for it. That you've got to figure out not only the technology push, but the market pull. And so we do a lot of training and a lot of emphasis on our companies, even before they apply, starting to do customer discovery and figure out if they build something, will it solve a problem for somebody? And who is that somebody? I'm going to stop there, Madeline. I have some more tactical things here about next steps, but that's really the philosophy part of this presentation. So
okay, great.
Pause there. I can keep going if you want.
No, perfect timing. I've gotten a few questions I've been furiously writing down, so this is a perfect stopping place. Okay, so one of the first things that you said, I'm wondering if you have a sense of approximately how many of those companies that are awarded phase 1 funding end up being awarded phase 2 funding as well.
So the phase 1 success rate is about 15%, 1.5. So about 1 in 7 companies receives that.
Okay.
Out of those companies, those are the only companies that can apply for the second phase. The second phase is about 1 in 2. It's about half who get phase 2.
Okay.
So those are the rough numbers. It could be up or down by 5%, but that's about the values. Sure.
So you're what that tells me is you're really doing the significant vetting on the early end. If you have 1 out of 2 chances to make it to phase 2.
Yeah.
I noticed that you said if the company is doing well during phase 1, they're more likely to get phase 2. What are some of the metrics that you're looking for to see that it's doing well with that initial investment?
I mean, both during phase 1 and looking at phase 2, and then in phase 2, there's other add-on funding we can provide for phase 2. And so in both cases, the things we look for to decide whether to double down on a company are similar. I mean, number one is that we've asked for a company with high technical risk, which usually means there are existential risks. So by the end of phase 1, we're hoping that most of them are pretty well in hands. Maybe you don't have a prototype yet, but you're able to at least show that you think there's nothing that's stopping you from getting there.
Sure.
Stopping you cold. There's no brick wall. So there's some amount of focus on the obviously technical progress. Sure. I think more importantly, because the companies we fund have they typically have a very high level technical teams, I mean, because we're the National Science Foundation, because of what we do, it's usually not the case that this team doesn't know what they're doing in the R&D phase. But we do look very significantly at the work they're doing outside the technology, outside the lab bench. And so mostly with regard to customer discovery and with regard to building the other aspects of their company. So kind of building advisors, building an understanding of, what their path to market is going to be, proving out their business model. Those things we don't pay for. Remember, we only pay for R&D. but we're really hoping that we're going to see significant progress on those aspects during the phase one, because that's a significant differentiator. Because with these companies, we've worked with 4,000 of them in the last 12 years that I've been here, and we see them through their process, and we see why they fail and why they succeed. And even though they're these huge technical risks that we ask them for, the biggest reason they fail are not technical. They're all market-based risks. The biggest reason is that they're building something nobody actually cares about. And that's something that you should be able to try to manage that risk without having to spend a lot of money on R&D. So we're looking for those common market-based risks for them to start managing them as well, so that they don't spend a bunch of money on R&D and then realize it was actually a different issue that was going to kill them, the whole time.
Right. I mean, that's among independent inventors, that's the most common reason why ultimately an invention is not brought to market or commercialized, is that there's really not a market for it. Yeah. And similarly, we think it's really important to get some good feedback on that before you've gone too far down that road. So you can either pivot, you can redesign what you're working on, or potentially you decide to walk away after having received that feedback. As far as the companies that end up becoming successful, are there certain ways of doing customer discovery or best practices, or how do you, are you really nurturing along a potential exit or acquisition from that very beginning? Or I would love to hear you expand a little on that, because that's something inventors and startups very much need to know how to do as well.
Yeah, so we're obsessed with customer discovery, and it's mostly because we've seen so many companies fail. So we've actually created a program called the Innovation Core. It spawned out of this issue that we were talking about, where these companies were spending a bunch of money building new technology and then dying for these customer-based reasons. So we built a program. One of our program directors left the SBIR program and created a new program called I-Core, which started at NSF and is now across the entire federal government, congressionally mandated as well. And I-Core is basically a government adaptation of the Lean Launchpad course that Steve Blank built. Steve Blank, the founder, kind of the godfather of the current customer discovery best practice that I can tell in the startup world. So we have a program to actually take teams through 100 customer discovery interviews with kind of commercial experts, who we vet and train. And that exists for teams who haven't even launched a venture yet. Those are teams that haven't even decided to go into a venture. We also provide a version of that same training to every company that gets the first phase of funding. The first thing we do is we make them stop doing research for a little bit and go do some interviews for folks, because it's not a very expensive thing to do, and it's a gigantic risk for these companies. So yeah, we absolutely we swear by that. Like I said, I think this I-Core program is expanding around the country, and it's actually, I think, kind of caught on in academia, where a lot of discovery and invention is done as well. So we provide that, and then the program directors themselves, again, we're hired for startup experience. We're also trying to give them feedback and kind of guidance and gentle nudging to continue to focus on commercial things during the process.
Sure. I mean, from what you've said, that's really painting the picture that it's extremely important to do that early and to do that in a robust way, so that you're not just necessarily, some advice we give is to research the marketplace. You're looking, of course, does this invention or product already exist? Yes or no? Does it exist in the prior art? But from what I'm hearing from you, you're taking it a much step further by actually interviewing people who are potential customers and otherwise, to get that feedback early on. And I'm guessing that becomes part of the design process as well, or allows maybe to shift where the technical R&D is even being done. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's right. And the reason we've actually created our funding goes through a kind of grant that we've actually specifically specialized to be maximally flexible for that reason, right? So different kinds of government funding have different levels of flexibility. A contract is very inflexible typically. Some agencies use contracts based on different types of needs. Ours is a grant, which is the most flexible kind of government type of instrument, but it's also a grant that has the special flexibilities built in to be even more. And so one thing that our companies often do is, when they start having that first contact with customer, almost always something changes. Sometimes it's just business model and customer, but sometimes like, look, the research I was going to do is no longer relevant. It's the customer doesn't care about this feature that I wanted to prove out. And so they're going to just erase that and work with us, the agency, to kind of rebuild the research plan so that it's now kind of been pivoted toward the customer they think is the right customer. And so the goal is to have a living document, that the funding agreement, that is something that can be changed based on learning about the market.
Interesting. And would you say that companies that do take customer discovery maybe the most seriously are the most invested, that tends to relate to ultimately their success?
Yeah, there's a big correlation there. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, there's obviously the reason that, the hardest thing, the most important stakeholder for your company is your customer. That's, without that, there's nothing else that matters. And in many cases, if you're an inventor, the person who maybe benefits from your invention might not be at all like you, right? There's nothing to say that the person who uses your invention has any same experiences as you, right? This is very true for very scientific founders like myself, right? Again, I was studying magnetic thin films. I was doing this very esoteric stuff. Turned out there was a use case for that sensor that was an imaging tool. Turns out that worked well for semiconductor. I have no idea what the semiconductor industry was, right? And unfortunately, this customer discovery stuff wasn't around enough for me to really embrace it with two hands. So I wasted a lot of time at my startup having not kind of understanding how important this was. But again, there's a lot of inventors where like you have no sense of your customer. You have no sense of what they do, what they worry about, what gets them promoted, what gets them fired, and how what the competition is, what the other options they have are. And so it's impossible to really overstate how important that lack of empathy can be, right? If you assume what your customer wants, you're just asking for trouble as an entrepreneur, because you really can't predict it. And even once you have your product and you've talked to them, you still sometimes can't predict what they're going to do. So yeah, I think that's I think a lot of inventors overstate the risk to like people stealing their idea, and they understate the risk to customers not caring about their idea. That's the general trend we've seen with our companies.
That trend is very much exists within the inventor community, where we try to make it clear that companies aren't in the habit of stealing ideas. However, if you end up having a successful product and that is popular and useful, yes, you're going to want to be thinking about imitators and copycats. But that's fundamentally one in which you've proved the utility, you've proved the market, it exists, you've done all that legwork. That's quite different from the seed of something.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right.
I want to touch on one other thing that stood out to me. You explained that you're looking for something about the technology that is unique. It's that special sauce. There's a tendency among inventors to think like, when they want to try to convey the special sauce or why someone should care about their invention, they'll pull like the size of the market could be this big. And if it only gets 1% of this, then, it'll be profitable. And they go really grandiose. How do you convey that secret sauce in a way that gets people interested, but maybe doesn't oversell or over deliver when frankly you're that de-risking process?
Yeah, that's a great point. So first of all, the top-down market analysis is really dangerous in my experience. Starting from a really big, broad market and getting some small percentage of it, I've never actually seen that happen. And I funded with and worked with 300 different companies. And if they're lucky, the best thing they can do to convince me is that they can try to guess who the first 5 people will be. So bottom up, and bottom up would be, starting from the need and then working your way up for how many people have that need. So this is like, I think this is called a Pauli problem, where Wolfgang Pauli would say like, can you estimate how many piano tuners there are in the city of Chicago? That was a kind of example. And so that's the kind of, if you want to size your market, I would start from that bottom up need and understand that. But I think more important than the size of the market is to viscerally get me inside the head of who your early customers, who are the first 5 people who are going to write you a check, and and tell me about their life, right? Tell me that you understand them really deeply and intimately. So I would say that's my advice on how to kind of size and kind of describe a market to at least to the type of investor that we are. As far as kind of pitching your company, I think the idea is basically, when you talk about unfair competitive advantage, the important thing is to be able to point to something that your team has that no one else can copycat. And a patent can sometimes do that if you're prosecuting it well, or the potential of a patent can do it. You know, it depends. Like there are some software projects where a patent is actually not advisable. And so my colleagues who work in the software space, the defensible innovation they have is oftentimes this trade secret where it's something that's not ever patented, but it's something that would be very hard for someone else to reverse engineer. And you can copyright software. There's other ways to do that. Sometimes that helps. But basically, usually there's something embedded in the way you do things that is special enough that the investor kind of understands it. So one example for this is a company we funded in the 90s called Intralays that developed laser eye surgery. So in that case, it's like, look, up until that point, the only way to fix your eye was to actually cut it with a knife, with a blade. That was how surgery was done. Now we're using a laser, right? That conveys a really disruptive way of doing things without actually giving away a lot of detail. I think if you have a story like that, that's a really powerful way to be able to convey that to people. And so I think, you know, like anything else as an entrepreneur, the best way to kind of figure out how to pitch this is to just talk to smart people and try things with them. I'm surprised by how many people they submit a proposal and no one else has ever even read any of the key arguments, right? It's crazy to me that, like, you know, you know, you haven't even given anything a test ride. So
do you think that's coming from that fear of sharing the idea with anyone because it's going to be ripped off, or that they're doing the right thing by keeping it to themselves? What is that?
Yeah, I think some of it is. I think some of it is that they are not wanting to be, they're very passionate about what they're doing and they're a little afraid to be criticized and to get negative feedback. And as an entrepreneur, that's natural. You should be passionate about what you're doing. We want you to have your whole heart in it. That's actually one of the biggest indicators. You know, you can't measure that directly, but you can kind of sense it when you work with a company, and that's a huge positive sign for your company. But you also have to be very willing to, like, take the beating, honestly, because nobody brings this new technology to market and builds a company without having a lot of setbacks, I think. So I think there's also a personality trait. You have to be dogged and you have to be gritty, but you also have to be very open to feedback and kind of and not take it personally. That's a hard combination. But one of the reasons that we think customer discovery and these going to talk to customers tends to correlate with successful companies is not just because you know more about your markets, because if you're willing to do that, to go talk to people you have nothing in common with and put yourself kind of at their mercy and say, look, I don't know anything, teach me about what your job is. That's actually an indicator that you're willing to go outside your comfort zone, which is a huge plus for an entrepreneur. So, so yeah, it could be the fear of giving away the idea, but I suspect a lot of it is just making yourself vulnerable. If you're going to tell somebody, look, this is my idea, I'm going to commit my life to making this happen. If they read it and think it's stupid, that's a hard, that's a hard thing to swallow. I think the other thing about telling people what you're doing is that you're actually committing yourself to it.
Yeah.
You know, if you haven't told anybody, you can just kind of stop one day and there's no blowback. If you've told everyone I'm going to do this, you're in. You got to do it now. Otherwise, everyone's going to say, "Hey, you said you're going to do this." So I kind of like people telling people they're going to do it because I like that. That's like, look, I'm making a promise to my community that I'm locking myself into trying to get this done. So anyway, I'm off your question, but yeah.
No, that's so true. And I think about that tension between, something I really admire about inventors is that they believe in themselves and in their invention. And frankly, that's an absolute must, because if you don't have that belief, there's no way you're going to overcome the obstacles that you need to. At the very same time, I have noticed that there is sometimes a reluctance to listen to the advice of others and actually internalize that and pay attention to it. So I think that it makes perfect sense to me that that's something you've noticed. I'm seeing a few requests in the comments to address some questions that have been asked. So I pulled out some that I thought were on point. Ben asked for phase 1 funding, what is the basic timeline from the funding the application or submitting, I believe, the application to the NSF to determining of the grant approval / denial?
That's great. Actually, I'm going to show one more slide that I think is helpful in case people want to understand the next steps. I'll answer the question, but let me put this up real quick. So this is our process for phase one. Don't worry about past phase one at this point. That's in the future, and things will change a lot by the time you get to phase two. So basically, there's two steps here. That number 2, number 3 here are actually steps that you have to take. Now, the rest of this is just kind of information. This is on our website, by the way. It's I'll put my slide at the end so you have it, but it's seedfund.nsf.gov. So the project pitch is the first step, and this is something that you can submit on our website anytime. It's about 1,000 to 1,500 words of total content. It's not proprietary. It's going to be very high level, and it's going to be just basically give me a paragraph about who you are, what you're trying to do in the market, what your innovation is, and what you need money for, basically. And you can read all this on our website. That's something you can submit anytime. And what happens is that's just a way for us to figure out if we think you might be a good fit before you go through. As you know, it's a government, so there will be a pretty burdensome process to request funding. But this project pitch is pretty lightweight and pretty easy. Once you submit that, typically we respond within about 2 weeks. And the response will either be an invitation to go to the full proposal, which is the full application and feedback, or us telling you, look, we don't think it's a good fit and here's why. The full proposal is something that there's windows about every few months that you can submit to. It is a 15-page kind of core document and some supplementary documents. So the full proposal will take you a week or 2 if you're fast, honestly. That process will take between 4 to 6 months to get funding in hand once you submit. So if you start now and you do everything as fast as possible, you're still not looking at getting the funding into your bank account until kind of like late spring, early summer of 2023. So we are not a fast process. Most investors aren't, by the way. You think they are, but they're not. But yeah, we're especially slow. So if you are thinking you need funding sooner than that, we may be just not a good fit.
That actually strikes me as pretty quick. We have a question from John who asks, aren't applicants required to have a PhD? Also, aren't almost all of the grants required to address a specific solicitation put out by the agency?
So there's no requirement for a PhD. We are looking for a pretty significant, sometimes daunting R&D plan. And so it's not even that the applicant, but if you're going to do something that is a kind of at the frontier of science or engineering, we do need to see that the team, maybe partners of yours or somebody on your team has the relevant technical experience. Sometimes a PhD is oftentimes the way to get, if you want to do synthetic biology, you want to splice genes. Most people who know how to do that have PhDs. You don't have to. We want to really see whether you have the technical skills to carry out the project. It's less important what specific degree you have. At NSF, a lot of our teams have PhDs up on board because that's the field they're in. That's how you get trained in that field, but not all of them. A lot of our computer science, we have about a third of our proposals are software, and a lot of software innovators don't bother to get the PhD. They go straight out of the master's degree or less. At other agencies, that may be less of a flexibility. And for the second question about responding to an agency need, that's actually true everywhere but here. Most everywhere but here. I mean, there's various levels of flexibility, but I think I'm fair to say that NSF is the only agency where we basically don't have any dog in that fight, in the fight of caring what you build or what technology area you're trying to push. And that's because we're the only agency that doesn't have either a need to buy and use stuff that you're building. We're not going to ever buy your products. We're not going to be a user, nor do we have a specific agency focus area, right? Like the Department of Energy or NASA, those all have specific areas of technology. We don't have that. So we figure the best thing we can do is give that freedom back to you. But you're right. If you approach other agencies, the thing you should do at the very beginning is look for topics. That's the most important gate you need to figure out, because if you don't meet their topics, that's the end of the conversation. But for NSF, you should leave that aside. We're not interested in making you conform to our topics. We think actually one of the biggest advantages of our program is that we don't require you to do that.
Ben, I have a question for you, and it's based on Peter's question here. Last week, I talked to an inventor. They had an energy invention, and we quite often guide people to license their products, and they can make a virtual prototype, a few bucks on a prototype. That's all they need. But this guy needed at least hundreds of thousands of dollars to prove his energy technology, right? At least. Okay, and so that's tapers in with, but his ultimate goal was to license it. So that tapers in with Peter's question here. What if your aggressive commercialization plan is to license to a large company? So can people get funding for a technology with the goal of licensing it rather than venturing it? That's the big question. I had it from an inventor just last week, and I couldn't answer that one.
The great question. So let me answer it in two separate ways. Our funding requires that there's a small business involved, that a business is incorporated, it could be an LLC, but that it exists to be able to apply and receive the funding. That's a congressional requirement. So if you're never going to actually create a small business, it could be even a sole proprietorship. But if you're not going to do that, then there's nothing we can do for you. But if the goal of that small business is to kind of get quickly to a license and get out early, that's fine. I think you'll want to kind of convey why that's the right strategy. And if that's going to limit the impact of the innovation, you're going to want to talk about that, because obviously with two proposals, if in some cases cutting that license will potentially limit the field of use of the innovation, not always, but sometimes it's the right strategy. Sometimes it has impacts there. So you want to kind of basically just lay out how whatever strategy you have, whether it's licensing or something else, how that's going to kind of meet the impact criteria we're looking for. And the criteria, yeah,
you can dramatically increase the time to market, because you're trying to start this company from scratch, get no distribution, anything, but you license it to a large player and they just plug it into their machine. The distribution, the employees, the everything, you know.
I think that's right. And actually, that's the most common way. We've had about 290 companies over the last 6 years exit, right, be acquired or merge. That's usually how companies are successful. And it is exactly like you said, it's because the stuff that they need to do, the technology development and understanding the market, that's done. And so now the idea is it's basically taking a proven business model and scaling it. And existing companies have the resources to do that better. And that's why companies typically exit everywhere. But I will say that in my experience, I've had a lot of companies who ended up licensing the technology. It's pretty rare for them to basically, from the very beginning, say, this is the only path. I'm going to basically build my company to only have this path. My experience is that you license the company, the best way to get your license done is to actually convince people who might license your company that you don't need them to license your company, your technology or your company, right? And so doing a licensing model doesn't get you out of any of the hard commercial work. It doesn't get you out of understanding your customer or your market or your business model. So I think that's a fine model, but we have seen in the past where people think, well, if I'm going to license this, then I don't need to do anything but technology. I just need to build the technology and then I'm done. And in my experience, that actually doesn't get you there. I've never seen a company be able to kind of do that quickly enough without having kind of gone through a lot of other commercial cycles to understand their market and their stakeholders.
Got it.
Sure. Is this only available for Americans, Ben?
So the eligibility, and I can put a link in the chat. I think I can do that to show you the eligibility. So we get the eligibility from Congress through the Small Business Administration. The rules around who applies is the American, it has to be a US based small business. So which means it has to have at least a place of business in the US. And the business has to be majority owned and operated by US citizens or residents. And majority owned and operated means, 50% or more of the ownership and the control of the company. And so you could have a company owned by no American citizens as long as they're residents and they're doing the work inside the US, that's fine. If the company is foreign and the owners are foreign, then legally it's not eligible to apply. You could even have somebody who's a permanent resident who's actually living overseas who would qualify as that ownership. But yeah, if there's we do need to see that rule. The other thing we need to see is if the company is basically being very open about how the fact they don't want to really they pretty quickly want to take everything overseas, right? Sometimes manufacturing and stuff is overseas, but if you're going to say, look, I'm taking this entire company overseas, that will affect our judgment, because our goal is to help the economic competitiveness of the United States, and our goal is to really help the taxpayers, justify to the taxpayers that this is benefiting them. Sure. So if there's international customers, fine. If there's international partners, fine. If the company starts to look like it's spiritually anchored elsewhere, then it starts to be a concern for us.
That makes sense.
Mr. Dioma has an amazing question that I think is going to benefit everybody. Do you have people who can help us fill out the applications for best outcomes? So, and I'll expand on that. If you don't have people, how do you suggest they figure out how to do this and do a good job of it? Because most people have never done it before.
So for the project pitch, I think it's a light enough lift and simple enough, straightforward enough that you should just do it yourself. I don't get a sense having people having gone through that process that it's daunting. So for that part, I would say, I think just try it. For the full proposal, I can understand why you would want to have help, and I can't recommend folks. I'm not allowed to do that since I'm one of the people who makes the decisions. I will say that every state, I think almost every state has a state-funded or more than one state-funded office whose job is to help folks do SBIR, STTR. Some of them do bring in third-party consultants to help you, but they all have assistants. So the first thing I would recommend, and I wouldn't do this now, I would do this if you get to the full proposal, I wouldn't worry about it yet, is to see if your state has resources. The government provides funding to various organizations to help them help you with these applications. The other thing I would say is that you can look at our full proposal. It's really a hybrid of an investment pitch and a research proposal, right? That's kind of the two things that it is. It's great if you can find people in your network who kind of know those things. So people who've written, scientists, professors, faculty members, people who've written research proposals, even if they're not startup, even if they're just basic research, I think that perspective, they can really help you understand the kind of flavor of the document. And those people honestly will probably be useful for your company anyway if you're working on anything scientific. So having some advisors there would probably be a good investment if you can find someone who's willing to help you. And the same thing on the investment side. There's people who are either investors or entrepreneurs, both of whom are usually willing to give their time to startups and to inventors. And so if you can maybe get those types of people to look at your document, I think you're pretty close to the type of look we're going to take of it, right? Again, that's where those are the two roles that all of us have had as program directors. We've been scientists writing papers and proposals and describing research plans. We've been in the world of startups kind of pitching and hearing pitches. So that will be a good approximation for what our point of view will be.
Nice. We've gotten a lot of our audience is the solo inventor. They're not necessarily working in a team. What is the understanding behind why it's specifically, it sounds like, even though to me, a two-person team, that's much more closer to being a solo practitioner than having like a lot of people on your side. What is the thinking behind that? Or why does there seem to be that the teams are being invested in, not necessarily individuals?
We do have one-person companies. Again, the two-person team is just a median value, which means that there's a lot of teams that are one. I think, there's a few reasons, right? So we have a lot of solo founders, right? I think there's a difference between a solo founder and basically a one-person team. I think a one-person team where there's really nobody who's even kind of supporting, I think it's just hard to do all the things you need to do, both technically and commercially. There's a lot of work that exists, and if you want to move fast, at least relatively fast, it's just hard to have enough hours in the day to do all the things that we look for. That doesn't mean you have to give up control of your company, but to find someone to help is valuable. I also think, and this is kind of more of a judgment call, but having somebody, and you have to know it when you see it, but having somebody who can be a true co-founder, right? So somebody who's kind of with you and in all the important decisions, and you're working directly as kind of co-equals. You can't force that. There's, if you don't, it's like marriage. Don't force it. Like if you find the right person, you get married. If not, don't try to say, I'm going to get married in the next 3 months. I don't know who. I'm going to find somebody. It doesn't work that way. But there's data on this that having, especially for a company that's got big ambitions to do something really important and disruptive, having multiple founders can be really helpful. And part of that is just that you have more time, more hours between you. But part of it is that there's ability to complement each other. If you're an inventor, maybe you don't have experience talking to customers. Maybe you need somebody to do that. There's a lot of advantages to having multiple perspectives. It also keeps the team a little more balanced. So if you look at a lot of these companies, any of your favorite startups, very often there were 2 or 3 co-founders. Not always, but we see there's a lot of data about how that actually is helpful. I think the last thing I would say is that as to convince you all that you might want to find somebody is that, you know, if you're going to go through this process where you're doing all these things, inventing and R&D and talking to customers and talking to partners and raising investment, whatever, it's lonely. And you can talk to somebody about it who's not in your company, but they don't really understand it unless they're inside. And it's emotionally, I think, a lot harder if you're by yourself. It's not true for anything you're going to do. You need support. So again, it's not for everybody. I mean, some people can do it themselves, but
Sure.
I've seen some people try to do this by themselves, and it's hard to watch because they really get ground down by the process. It happens to multiple people too. Sometimes you can be 2 or 3 people and you can all get ground down, but it's a little easier to keep the morale up if you have people to kind of in the boat with you.
Ben, we got about 8 minutes, so we can
Yep.
still do some questions, Mal. But
I could try to be more less verbose too.
No, it's great answers. In the
Yeah,
meantime, if everybody could type in their thank yous to Ben, maybe something beyond just the word thank you, like express to him how you appreciate him coming on and sharing this info. So we have some more time. We're not done yet, but I just thought I'd prompt people to type their thank yous in the chat. Go ahead, Mal.
Yeah, no, your answers are phenomenal and so relevant on numerous levels to even people who are working on inventions that don't require the technical R&D that we're specifically talking about during this hour. Since they have been so good, I'll try to squeeze in a couple more. I liked this one that I just saw. Well, first, is it possible to use part of the funding to cover the legal fees for patenting?
Yes, in some cases. So one thing I will say is that our funding, we do cover most of the overhead and kind of indirect costs, the associated costs with hiring people and doing stuff, doing R&D. Patenting, sometimes we do if the patent is something that is covered by, is something that you invented with our funding, it's come into being with our funding, then you can pay for it. If not, there's always an option. Our funding has a fee, has a profit attached to it. So if you get funding from us, between 7 and 10% of that funding is yours with no strings attached, and you can use that for anything you want, or you can save it. So even if you don't have the ability to pay for patents with the direct costs of our funding, you have this 7 to 10% that you can basically use for anything you like. And a lot of our folks do use that for that type of expense.
That makes sense.
So what are you funding with the money? Are you funding people's salaries,
Yep.
engineers' salary? Those are you funding your own salary as a co-founder or not? As an owner?
You can definitely, the biggest expense is people working on R&D, people putting in hours to do the research. Yeah, co-founders are very often people doing the technical work. That's, very often the CEO is also the inventor. That's common. You can buy materials, you can pay for facilities, you can pay your rent, your utilities, you can pay a partner, an organization, a university to do testing for you. You can pay a third-party lab. You can pay a consultant. So almost any activity that is part of R&D is allowable. It just has to be something you can tie back to those research tasks.
Thank you.
Phenomenal. Okay, I'll squeeze in one more before we wind down. Does the NSF value more the commerciality of a patent or the novelty of the technology when considering proposals?
So both. To some extent, if your technology isn't novel, R&D may not actually extend your it may not actually help your company as much. I mean, every company probably, a lot of companies have to do technical work, but if your product is not novel at all, let's take that example, you're probably not doing R&D, you're probably doing just engineering. There's a difference, and we can talk about that. So to some extent, if your product has no risk and no innovation, R&D might not actually help you, and so we can't really help you since that's the only tool in our toolbox is paying for that. But obviously, if we don't see any commercial value for your product, then we don't want to help you because we don't see the value that we're not convinced of the value that helping you is going to have on the broader society, and that's our mandate. So I think it's hard to answer that question. It's kind of a chicken and egg. We need to see both because it does impact the model that we have. But yeah, I think there's a sliding scale, right? If your product has these dramatic broader impacts, but maybe the market size is smaller, that's fine. We're not requiring maximizing every dollar here. We're looking at this as something that your company's going to be commercially successful. But if you're going to have a major non-commercial impact on the country, like you're going to help educate the next generation or help clean up the environment or help whatever, we're willing to take most of our returns in those kind of non-economic impacts and have a smaller market than if you just had a pure economic impact. So one example is a company we funded called Marinus Analytics. That was actually, she was an undergraduate student who spun out of her senior project at Carnegie Mellon. And she basically built an AI model to do facial recognition and crawl the internet to actually identify victims of sex trafficking. And this became a software product that now is used by government agencies. And there was just a recent news article. This product has been used to save 1,600 women from sex trafficking.
Wow.
And so in that case, if the market is small, that's okay, right? If the dollar value of the company is never going to be a 1,000-person company, that's probably okay. And so that's the last thing I would kind of maybe leave you folks with is that, you know, we talk a lot about commercial things, but we're looking for lots of different kinds of impacts, and we're flexible about how we get the impact.
Oh.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. The social impact aspect is really.
Do you want to share any more slides, Ben? I was going to jump back to everybody in the room.
I have one more slide that just has some examples, and I think you can read about a lot of these on our website. Let me put the slide up in case you want to take down some of the company names and look them up. You know, there's lots of, these are all companies that are pretty well established with lots of media and news clippings and stuff. But the thing I put up here is just, I don't have time to go through them, I think, but you can see the kind of the range of technology that exists here, you know, from battery technology to cybersecurity to new materials to robotics to manufacturing to biology. So, you know, it's a big tent we have here with a lot of crazy smart people who are doing really cool stuff.
That's incredible. Where can everyone go and learn more about what kinds of, if they're a good fit for the program, if they want to apply? So
my contact info is here. Our Twitter handle is here. I know Twitter is a weird thing right now. The website is at the bottom. That's probably the biggest place to go. I think most of the information is available there, including the portfolio. You can look up our entire, you know, the government funds something, there's public records, so you can look up every company we've ever funded and see kind of examples of what we do and learn more about how to start the process at the website.
That's absolutely incredible. Thank you for sharing your contact information. Multiple people asked for that as well.
Yeah.
And for people asking in the audience, in addition to hosting this recording on the IGA website, you'll also be able to find it on YouTube, because we think it's really important that more people access this information, and we know that they will by being able to search there. We've reached the 5 o'clock